For many centuries, London was a dangerous place. It was a magnet for the very worst kind of people. Jack the Ripper dominated the headlines. But he wasn't the only killer around. Murder was afoot. The fear of death was everywhere. But police had their work cut out to track the culprits down. In this series, we'll be investigating some of the country's most notorious and intriguing crimes.
Female defendant.
Sexual intrigue, vicious murder, as well as the latest technology, fed the nation's insatiable desire for gruesome stories of London's dark side. Brighton in summer is a popular spot and has been so for centuries. In the Georgian era, it was a stylish retreat of the rich and famous. Later in the 19th century, the advance of the railways opened up the seaside town. People from all walks of life journeyed there for its fresh air and long sunny days. By the 1930s, Brighton was an easy and popular day trip from London. But if that modern train line brought tourists to the town, it also brought those with a darker purpose.
Brighton's always been a rather raffish place, even since the days of the Prince Regent and general naughtiness in the early 19th century. The elegant terraces, expensive hotels, rich people, and yet behind it there's a substratum of prostitution and crime.
Brighton was a very thrusting, energetic sort of town. It was a bit, I suppose, like a comprehensive school, with the wealthy at one end, the very wealthy, and the low life at the other end. You know, it had such a mixed population, such a cosmopolitan place.
It was exciting and vibrant, a little bit edgy and a little bit violent at times, and so I think it attracted people there that believed that things were going to happen. It was close enough to London to attract some of the worst elements of criminals to go down there to see what they could do at Brighton.
The criminal underworld thrived off the close connections with London. Razor-wielding gangs fought for supremacy. The town was plagued by racketeering and extortion, gambling and prostitution. But murder was the crime that the town became most famous for. It was murder that in this decade gave Brighton its unwanted nickname, Queen of the Slaughtering Places.
June 1934 was a very, very hot month, and people flocked down to Brighton in huge numbers, and everybody seemed to be enjoying themselves at that time, except in the railway station at Brighton.
A station porter had alerted the police to a foul-smelling trunk, the contents of which would shock the nation. Inside the trunk, wrapped in layers of cheap brown paper and packed around with cotton wool, was a parcel. It was secured with a long length of sash cord. The police untied it and opened it. Inside was the dismembered torso of a young woman. Recognizing the severity of the crime, the Chief Constable of Brighton Police requested assistance from London.
It was usual at that time for provincial forces to call in the Yard because the Yard had the expertise and the resources to help in inquiries. It should also be added that liaison between various police forces wasn't very good at that time, so it's a good idea to have officers down from London who might also know likely lads or lasses who were involved in crime in Brighton.
That evening, just hours after the discovery of the torso, Chief Inspector Robert Donaldson and Detective Sergeant Edward Sorrell arrived in Brighton to take charge of the investigation.
The trunk was left at the station on the 6th of June, Derby Day, racing fans. According to the tag number, staff estimate it was deposited there between 6 and 7 p.m. Obviously, we're going to be questioning everyone who was on duty at that time.
More than 90 pieces of luggage were left in the cloakroom on that day alone, gentlemen. It will be difficult for staff to remember individuals, so we will have to jog their memories.
The trunk was a common make, but it was new. It would also have been heavy. It may have taken 2 people to carry, so an employee, a porter, might have even helped the suspect with it.
This will not be an easy case. As it stands, we do not have much to work with, but if we are thorough, and if we are precise, gentlemen, I do believe we will apprehend those responsible for this.
Who was the killer? And who was the victim? And where was the rest of her? There were few clues. There were no identifying marks on the body and no fingerprints on the suitcase. The one lead police had was a fragment of handwriting found on the paper wrapped around the body. A single word, written in blue pencil, could just be made out. Ford.
So, they found the legs.
As in Brighton, staff at King's Cross Station in London had become alarmed by a rancid smell in the luggage room. Finally, on the evening of the 18th of June, they discovered the source of the stench: the brown trunk. It had been left there on the 7th of June, one day after the first trunk had been deposited in Brighton. Inside this second case, neatly wrapped in oil-soaked paper, were the rotting legs and feet of a young woman. Once again, station staff had no clear memory or record of who had left the trunk, and its contents offered few clues either. An alert was sent out to stations across the country. Left luggage rooms were searched up and down the land. But there was no sign of the body's head or arms anywhere.
People would send trunks full of luggage on the railways quite regularly. So there were a lot of these trunks about, and it seemed at one stage as though there were an awful lot of trunks with dead bodies inside them.
Luckily, most murderers are amateurs at it, and most of them don't seem to realise how difficult it is to dispose of a body. So you've got to find somewhere to put it, or cut it up, or do something of that sort. So yes, trunks, murder, suitcases, you name it. They seem to come up fairly regularly.
The torso and legs were examined by Home Office pathologist Sir Bernard Spilsbury. By this time, Spilsbury was a legend. His evidence had proved decisive in securing the convictions of Dr. Crippen in 1910 and the brides in the Bath murderer George Smith in 1915. 2 decades later, he was still the most renowned and respected pathologist in the country.
Sir Bernard's report, sir. King's Cross legs are a match.
she was pregnant.
4 to 5 months. Could be why she was killed.
Perhaps so.
Otherwise, she was in good health. No natural cause of death detected.
The condition of the feet and toenails suggests she was particular in matters of personal hygiene.
I thought she could have been a dancer, sir.
Have you ever seen a dancer's feet, Sergeant?
No.
Well, they aren't pretty.
When have you seen a dancer's feet, sir?
Dismemberment occurred several hours at least after death. The press are going to love this.
Donaldson was right. Almost 50 representatives of local and national newspapers descended on Brighton. They loitered outside the police station day and night, eager for any scrap of information they could sensationalize for their readers. But such scraps were thin on the ground. The dead woman's identity was still unknown. How she died and where was another mystery. As yet, Inspector Donaldson was no closer to finding answers or the killer. Little did he know, however, that his whole investigation was about to be turned on its head. The case, which would become known as the Brighton Trunk Murders, was quickly gaining notoriety. But the police investigation had few clues to go on. With no way to identify the victim or killer, the police turned to the public. They did not disappoint. Donaldson and his team were soon overwhelmed by an avalanche of tip-offs. A card index with 13 different categories was needed just to cope. In New Kent Road, London, Annie Watts read the news reports with mounting alarm. She had not seen her 42-year-old daughter Violet in 3 years and feared the worst. Hers was but one tip among thousands. 800 missing women had been reported to the police. Donaldson and his team had to check every one. But among the 70 who were not found was Mrs. Watts' daughter. Born in 1891, Violet was a music hall artist. But singing and dancing in cheap venues for pennies was a difficult way to make a living. Often she relied on prostitution to get by.
Violet Saunders was from a family of 9. She eventually became part of a song and dance duo. She didn't exactly play the Palladium, it was something more like the Balham Hippodrome. Her partnership broke up in 1927. She took up with another man under the title of K&K. That lasted until the early 30s, but then they parted company, partly, I think, because she'd taken to the bottle a bit, and also perhaps was experimenting with drugs.
By 1933, she was going by the stage name of Violet Kay. It was in this year that she met a man calling himself Tony Mancini. He was more than a decade younger than her, but he had a quick smile and keen charms. In September that year, she asked him to come to Brighton with her. Mancini agreed.
She conceived a passion for Mancini, and she wanted him to move away from the violence of London down to Brighton. And for some months, Mancini lived off her earnings. They had a basement flat in Park Crescent, and when customers came calling, Mancini would go away and then return later on and pick up the money from Violet, which she was happy to give him. But she was also incredibly jealous.
Violet was too old to be the dead woman found at the train stations, but police were in no position to dismiss a lead. Weeks had passed, and they were no closer to finding the killer. When word reached them that Mancini had been witnessed disposing of women's clothing, Inspector Donaldson decided to bring him in.
Mancini. That's an Italian name, isn't it?
It is, sir, yes.
I don't hear much of an accent. Where was it you were born, Mr. Mancini?
London. I'm a London boy. They all know me up there.
Sergeant Sorrell and I are from the Metropolitan Police. Would we know you?
Not Brighton boys, then.
Scotland Yard.
Should have known they'd send the professionals for me.
Look, I'll tell you the truth. That's why you're here.
It's just a name. Mancini. I made it up.
Tony Mancini is not your name.
Cecil England. Louis. Cecil Louis England. You get all that?
Cecil Louis England.
Write down I'm telling the truth as well.
Why Mancini?
Now, geezer can call himself what he wants, can't he?
That rather depends on the reason.
Never liked Cecil.
Tony Mancini, his real name was Cecil England, but he also used the surname Notire.
He took the name Tony Mancini because there was a girl he knew, and she liked the men to be Italian, and so Mancini thought this was a great name, so it became Tony Mancini. He also was known as Tony English and Hyman Gold.
He was born on the 7th of January 1908 in New Cross, a working-class district of southeast London. Aged 18, he joined the Royal Air Force and served for 2 years before leaving with the rank of aircraftman first class.
Tony Mancini was a low-level criminal. He was in the Air Force for 2 years. He had either deserted or he'd been invited to leave the service. And he'd been a bit of a fairground boxer, but in the main he wasn't doing much work.
Just 20, he headed back to London. There he found occasional work as a barman in Knightsbridge or a hawker in the West End. But he was always short of money. In 1930, he was convicted for theft.
He was convicted of stealing silver and then of loitering with intent to commit a felony, and eventually of stealing from a dwelling house, for which he got 6 months. He'd had 3 months for the loitering. He was released around about 1932 and made his way to the West End.
On his release, he began work at a club near Leicester Square in the heart of London. He told co-workers there his name was Tony Mancini. It was at this club that he met Violet Kay.
Are you acquainted with a woman named Violet Kay?
You mean, do I know her?
Yes.
I know her, sir. I did. She were my missus till she left.
Where did she go?
I come home from work and find this letter saying she's leaving, going off with some other geezer, someone who can keep her better.
What was his name?
I didn't see it coming. Her leaving me. You know, I used to play for Queen's Park Rangers.
What was her new man's name?
Well, she didn't say. From what I've heard since, it was this Moore geezer. He had a bookmaker's office on Gloucester Road. Don't know where he is now.
When was this?
May?
When in May?
Well, I've been at the Skylark about a week, so 14th, something like that. Yeah, I come home from work and she were gone. Ungrateful cat.
Mr. Mancini.
England. Cecil Louis.
Mr. England. Can you tell us your whereabouts on Wednesday, the 6th of June this year?
It was Derby Day.
Yeah. I remember. Windsor lad. Had a nice little wager on him.
6th of June, where were you?
Work. Yeah. All day.
Until what time?
9:30. We're open pretty late.
And on the 7th?
Same. I work every day. You can ask them, they all know me in there.
Police kept watch as Mancini returned to the seaside cafe where he worked. He seemed unalarmed. After an afternoon serving food and drink to customers, he joined friends at a local dance hall. Donaldson called off the surveillance. It was a mistake. The next morning, the suspect was not to be found at his lodgings in Kemp Street, nor anywhere else in Brighton. Mancini had vanished. Brighton, 1934. Weeks had passed since the first discovery of the body parts in the trunk. But investigators, led by Inspector Robert Donaldson of the Metropolitan Police, were no closer to solving the crime. As an eager press and public waited on news, observers were struck by the similarities between the case and another crime from over a century before. For this was not the first trunk murder in Brighton's history. In 1831, the pregnant Celia Bashford was murdered by her husband, John Holloway. He was a violent bigamist who could not afford another child. He conspired with his second wife, Anne, to murder Celia. Holloway lured her to a house near the beach and strangled her with a rope. Together, John and Anne dismembered the body.
The first thing they did was to cut her arms off, her legs, and her head. And they were taken separately by wheelbarrow down to where Holloway was staying in Margaret Street and pushed them down the Privy. The next day, they decided that they had to get rid of the rest of the body, this dismembered corpse.
The trunk was put into a trunk, in effect. Rather like Mancini, he hired a wheelbarrow to take her to another spot, which was called Lover's Lane, and buried it in a shallow grave with items of clothing, which in fact was his undoing.
Two men were walking through a local park and they saw a piece of red cloth on the ground, and one of them poked it with a stick, and they found body parts. A lot of people turned up to see what was going on. We don't know what the identification was, but one of the women in the crowd said, "That's my sister."
That, together with gossip, because Brighton was a very small place in those days, pointed the finger at John Holloway, who was arrested. He told various stories, which none of which were true, and he was duly convicted.
Holloway's wife, Anne, soon confessed. He was tried and found guilty. He hanged on the 21st of December, 1831. There was no such easy resolution for police in 1934, however. Almost a month had passed since the beginning of the investigation, but the victim found in the luggage remained nameless, as did her killer. One suspect had been identified, a Londoner who went by the name of Tony Mancini. He had aroused suspicion by giving away women's clothing. His girlfriend Violet had not been seen for weeks. It seemed promising, but police were soon disappointed. Their inquiry showed that Violet was too old to be the woman in the luggage, and Mancini had been at work on the days the trunks were deposited at Brighton and London. It was another dead end. On the morning of the 16th of July, however, a man came into Brighton Police Station with new information. His name was George Barnard. He was Mancini's landlord. He told police that Mancini had suddenly vanished.
This is Donaldson. Don't tell me, Sergeant, he's done a runner. What?
Donaldson soon learned that Mancini had due cause to disappear. He had left behind many of his belongings, and among them was a large black trunk.
Mr. Mancini?
Inside, he could see evidence of a skull and head hair, and he thought he'd found the missing skull of the remains that were found at Brighton Station and King's Cross. But looking a little more deeply at the situation, realised, of course, that it was a whole body.
And the mothballs that he'd put around the corpse had had no effect. The stench was absolutely awful.
When they actually found the trunk with Violet Kay's body in it, it was, of course, a great surprise to the police because they all of a sudden had too many legs for it not to be two bodies. They did have some difficulty working out the identities.
Sergeant?
At 11:40 this morning, Sergeant Scales and I attended the lodgings of Cecil Luke.
Just call him Mancini.
Mancini was absent, believed absconded. In the flat, we found a large black trunk. It contained the body of a woman. We believe this to be Violet Kay, one of the women we've been tracing. A post-mortem will be carried out this evening by Sir Bernard Spilsbury, but it was obvious that the body had been in the trunk for some weeks.
At 5 p.m. that evening, Sir Bernard Spilsbury examined the body of Violet Kay at Brighton Mortuary. The still-dressed body was damp with decay, rotting green, red and brown. It had been in the trunk for weeks. Despite this advanced state of decomposition, Spilsbury was still able to tell police that Violet had been killed by a powerful blow to the side of her head. Alerts were sent out to police forces across the country. Mancini had to be found.
Spilsbury found the body of Violet not unnaturally badly decomposed after all these weeks, but he was able to detect a depressed fracture above her right ear, which he thought was the primary cause of death.
A blow to the head had dislodged a small piece of skull. Now, when Violet's body was found, there'd been a hammer and some coal. This could quite possibly have caused the wound.
Spilsbury also found, and his evidence is controversial here, that bruising to the head would have been inflicted 2 or 3 minutes before death.
Bernard Spilsbury said that it was certainly a murder and it couldn't have been an accident. And so the police were on the lookout for Mancini.
So, statements from the men who were with Mancini last night.
Right. What do they have to say?
They were with Mancini in the club after our men...
After I called them off, yes.
They accompanied Mancini to his lodgings in Kemp Street. Noticed the smell, of course. Then they all went for breakfast. They described Mancini as carefree.
Well, at least somebody is. Anything else?
After breakfast, they went to Preston Park Station, where Mancini boarded the 7 a.m. train to London Victoria.
Really? Victoria?
I've passed it on to the yard.
Good work, Sergeant. They'll find him.
Apparently, his last words to his friends were, "I'll be famous soon."
I'll be famous soon. Well, Sergeant, it's not disappointing.
But if Mancini had killed Violet, then what was his motive? Their relationship was a stormy one. Mancini was a womanizer, and Violet was easily provoked. Witnesses remembered a confrontation between the pair in early May. Violet was angry at Mancini for flirting with a young waitress at the cafe where he worked. Violet was never seen there again, nor was she seen by anyone else. On the 11th of May, Violet's sister in London received a poorly spelt telegram. It claimed to be from Violet. She was going away, it said. Her sister heard nothing more. Weeks later, Mancini was heard to boast of beating his girlfriend from pillar to post with a hammer.
The message said, "Gone away, gone abroad, sailing today, will write." The police got the original note, which had been handed in at the post office, and this matched up to Mancini's handwriting on the menus that he'd written at the Skylark Cafe.
And then he said, about women, you know, there's only one way to treat them. Don't use your fists, because you'll only hurt yourself. Use a hammer, as I did, and slosh them with it. A very strange thing to say for a man who hasn't been accused of murder, or even to be saying that kind of thing in case he shouldn't. But Mancini is a fairly unintelligent man, a man not capable of planning.
Sure enough, during searches at the flat where Mancini and Violet had lived, police found a charred metal hammerhead among the ashes of the fire. Its handle had been burned away as if someone had tried to destroy it. Whoever that somebody was seemed to do enough, for forensic techniques were rudimentary in the 1930s, and the burning of the hammer had removed anything which could link it to the murder. Despite all evidence being circumstantial, everything was pointing to Mancini. Donaldson and his team needed a confession, but in order to obtain one, they needed to track down the elusive Mancini. Having left his home in Brighton, Tony Mancini had fled to London, leaving behind most of his belongings, including a large black trunk containing the rotting body of his girlfriend, Violet Kay. The police were working around the clock to find him, and early on the 17th of July, Donaldson received the news he'd been waiting for. Mancini had been found and arrested. He had enjoyed his 2 days of freedom. He'd gone drinking with friends and even took the time to seduce a 17-year-old girl. Now, however, Mancini faced a far less pleasant encounter.
You say she was already dead when you found her?
Yeah. She was laying on the bed. Blood all over the sheets and everywhere.
Why did you not call the police?
I don't know. I was frightened. I couldn't prove I didn't do it, and I knew you'd blame me.
And that's when you bought the trunk?
Yeah.
And decided to take her with you when you moved to Kemp Street? You have no idea who might have killed her?
As God is my judge. I don't know. Well, she was a prostitute, you see. There was always men coming up to the house, all the hours. You ask my landlord, he'll tell you.
You are suggesting that one of these men, her clients, killed her?
Well, you hear about it, don't you? All I know is that I'm innocent. Except the fact I kept the body. I admit that. I should have gone to the police when I found her, but that's all I'd done. I never killed her.
They were sure of Mancini's guilt, but had no solid proof, and it was clear that a confession was out of the question. Despite this, they were convinced they had enough to satisfy a jury in a court of law.
A trunk containing a woman's body was found in a room which you occupied at 52 Kemp Street, Brighton. As a result of our inquiries, you are now to be charged with her murder. You are not obliged to say anything unless you wish to do so. But anything you do say will be taken down in writing and may be given in evidence. Is that understood?
I'll say it again. I'm not guilty.
Mancini's trial began at 10:30 on the 11th of December 1934. As always with such notorious cases, a large crowd had gathered outside the courthouse. A ballot was required to distribute the tickets for the public gallery. Following Mancini's plea of not guilty, the prosecution began. They told the jury that Mancini had killed Violet Kay, that he had stuffed her body, first into a cupboard and then a trunk, which he transported across Brighton to new accommodation. Suspicions raised by the smell and strange liquid seeping from the trunk were dismissed by Mancini until his police interview and flight from justice. The esteemed K.C. Norman Burkitt was the defense counsel, but even with his experience, he had his work cut out with Mancini.
When Mancini went to court, he was the villain. He was turned into an absolute monster. People booed and shouted and hissed. He was quite a loathsome creature. That Violet was characterized as a drunk, drug addict. She was a prostitute. That was her reputation, such as it was completely shredded.
The defence were very clever in making things more complicated than they needed being, and they did represent Violet Kay to have been jealous of an affair that Mancini might have been having with another waitress.
What Burkitt did very cleverly was to seed in the idea that she could have fallen down the steps into the area outside the basement flat at Park Crescent, had her fractured skull there, got up, tottered into the flat, and eventually undressed and lay down on the bed and died. It sounds, actually, on the face of it, a slightly far-fetched theory, but the way in which it was presented was highly professional, highly competent.
If he hadn't done the murder, all his offence was that he concealed the body. And he'd explained that away to the court by saying, because of his past criminal record, that would have told against him had he admitted to finding the body. And so he concealed the body for that reason. That, it was argued, was his main defence.
Unusually for trials like this, Mancini was called as a witness. It was a gamble. All eyes were on Mancini, but the slick Londoner thrived under the pressure.
Mancini, despite his rather villainous appearance, scarred face and all the rest of it, was actually rather a good witness. The reporter had noted that he was relatively well-spoken, seemed reasonably intelligent, and he seemed to put on rather a good act. The jury certainly were taken in by it. So what, in fact, Mancini was saying was, I'm a man who's got previous convictions. I wouldn't get a fair deal from the police. I know I was acting as a pimp for this woman. I shouldn't have been doing it, but I did it. I'm telling it as it is, and the jury took it.
To the astonishment of the country, they cleared Mancini of murder. He was released at once.
The trial was an extraordinary triumph for the defence. It's a textbook example for young lawyers in how to conduct a defence when all circumstances seem to be riding against you.
Everybody, it seems, thought Mancini had committed a murder. And Mancini had to be smuggled out of the back of the court. And so he was free.
He clearly did love the limelight, and he was a good witness on his own behalf. There's no doubt about that at all. He could attune his message to the circumstances.
Mancini escaped the noose. But what of the original murder? What of the woman found in pieces at Brighton and London? That investigation had continued. A porter at London Bridge Station recalled helping a man travelling to Brighton with a heavy suitcase. It was the 6th of June, the day before the first trunk was left at the station there. The porter remembered the contents of the case shifting with a dull thud as he lifted it. Somehow, it reminded him of meat. The unknown passenger had travelled from Dartford, the porter believed. But despite an exhaustive search there, police could not trace him. A woman then came forward on the 30th of July, 1934. She claimed that the blue writing found on the scrap of packing paper in the first trunk was hers. She worked for a confectionery company in Finsbury Park, London. Sometimes they received faulty stock, which they sent back to the manufacturers. It was this woman's job to wrap up the goods and dispatch them. Using a blue pencil, she would write the address, Meltis Company, Bedford. Once those faulty goods reached Bedford, however, the packing paper was shredded and reused in parcels sent to depots all across the country. Once again, the trail went cold. The killer of the young woman found in pieces at Brighton and King's Cross was never to be found, nor was her identity ever established. Her story remains unknown. The killer of Violet Kay, however, was eventually confirmed. In November 1976, Tony Mancini gave an interview to the News of the World. Finally, after more than 4 decades, the truth emerged. Mancini told the newspaper he had killed Violet. He'd thrown a hammer at her during one of their frequent arguments. Panicking, he'd then hidden the body and lied about Violet's whereabouts. Despite this confession, there was still no justice for Violet. The law said that a man tried and cleared of a crime could not face a jury again for the same offense. Mancini lived to an old age. Brighton would never forget that summer, however, when it was the murder capital of England, the queen of all slaughtering places. He was a small-time crook. That's what police thought at first. A scheme seemed to lurk behind his quick smile and sharp suits. And he had a reputation. Despite the rationing which still lingered in Britain years after the Second World War, John George Haigh was a man who could get you anything. But nobody knew the truth which lay behind his extravagant lifestyle. When police investigating the disappearance of an elderly widow in February 1949 brought Haigh in for questioning, they had no idea of the story they were about to uncover.
Apologies for keeping you waiting, Mr. Haig.
Please, do call me John.
Are you no Inspector Webb?
Oh, yes. Old friends by now.
Just a few more questions for you, John.
Of course. Anything I can do to help.
I was just telling Inspector Symes that you're a businessman.
Hurst Lee Products Limited. Director and Chief Engineer.
Oh, well, that must take you all around the country to work like that.
Oh, I get about on my rounds, yes.
It's a lovely-looking motor car, that Alvis of yours.
Isn't she a beauty?
Do you ever get to Horsham on your rounds, Mr. Haig?
Horsham? Yes, a fair bit, actually. Or I used to, at any rate. Not so much recently.
No. Well, when was the last time you were there?
It must be months. The pictures, one evening.
I see.
That the only time, John? Are you sure?
Yes. As far as I recall.
The thing is, Mr. Haig, I know that you have been to Horsham much more recently than that. We know that you have visited the jewellers on Middle Street on no fewer than 4 occasions in the last 10 days. You sold them all this. They're Mrs. Durand Deacon's, aren't they?
During the police investigation into the disappearance of Olive Durand Deacon, a jeweller had identified Haig as the man who had sold him her jewellery. There was now a direct link between Haig and the missing woman. He was no longer aiding the police in their investigation. He was now their prime suspect. Haig knew his devilish scheme was at an end.
It's time to tell us what happened, John.
I was wondering if you had those when we first started. I'm afraid it is a rather long story.
John George Haig was born in Lincolnshire on the 24th of July 1909. He was the only child of deeply religious working-class parents. The family were members of the Plymouth Brethren, a minority nonconformist group who believed they were a chosen people, superior to others.
I think the family background might give us the first clue as to John Haig's future. The only book in the house was the Bible. Newspapers were banned, and in fact it went as far as John's school friends not being encouraged to come back to the house. It was pretty isolated.
Haig's a very complex character to explain as a child. He excelled in maths and chemistry and in draftsmanship. He was a very musical child. He was actually given a scholarship to join Wakefield Cathedral.
He sang in the choir and played the organ in the cathedral. But he did seem to have got a real great talent for telling lies and getting away with it.
He also had a very sadistic streak. At an early age, he decided for himself that there really was nothing in religion. He was the master of his own ends. And maybe due to the fact that he had this superiority that it felt coming down the family line, he would bully people.
There was always this thing that the world was an evil place. And later on, he said he used to have these dreams where trees would turn into crucifixes and there'd be the dripping of blood. And this was all part of the background that he built up later on.
Haig's upbringing was strict, but not unloving. There were few signs in childhood of his later criminality, but almost as soon as he left school, he began the life of a petty crook and swindler.
It's insurance scams, embezzlement, fraud, petty thieving. That's going to be the pattern for the rest of his life, broken up by various spells of imprisonment.
He got convicted of fraud because he was involved with hire purchase deals. It was non-existent customers and non-existent cars. He also got involved in another fraud, which was to do with selling fictitious shares in companies.
His draftsmanship skills were immense. Many people thought he was one of the best forgers Britain ever had. He could copy someone's handwriting without any fluctuation. He was a great con man. He'd spend hours practicing in front of a mirror, doing different facial expressions. Classic psychopathic thing, really, to look into a mirror and actually take on that chameleon look of having a total facade of your expression.
Money was always the motive behind Haig's crimes. He longed for a lifestyle legitimate employment could not give him. By 1949, he had advanced to more serious crimes. By this time, Haig was living in London. There he resided at the Onslow Court Hotel in South Kensington. He was a rare, younger bachelor. Most of the residents in the upmarket establishment were elderly women, but Haig was a man who always enjoyed feeling special. Among the other residents was a wealthy widow named Olive Durand Deacon. Haig paid particular attention to the 68-year-old. He charmed the older woman, steadily worming his way into her confidence over meals in the dining room. It was there that Mrs. Durand Deacon must have told Haig about her business idea for artificial fingernails. Haig styled himself an engineer and entrepreneur. He told her his company was interested and invited her to his workshop in Crawley. So after lunch on the 18th of February, Mrs. Durand Deacon, in her black Persian lamb coat, met Haig at the hotel reception. They travelled down to the workshop together in his motor car. She did not return to the Onslow Court Hotel that evening, nor was she seen the next morning at breakfast.
Here we are.
How exciting!
Welcome to Hurstleaf Products Limited.
It's very practical.
Some of my most profitable ventures began here.
Well, from small acorns, great oaks do grow.
Oh, yes. I suppose they do.
Shall we have a look at some of our little acorns? The prototypes.
Oh, yes. Yes, of course. The prototypes. What am I thinking? Just straight ahead. Now, these are just to give you an idea. Your designs, of course, will be much more attractive.
The colour is very cheery, but the material, John...
What is it you've done?
I'm afraid it will sound all too fantastic for belief.
The sudden disappearance of Olive Durand-Deacon caused alarm. Fellow resident Constance Lane was particularly worried. Mrs. Durand-Deacon was a woman of regular habits. Disappearing like this just wasn't her style. Haig echoed Mrs. Lane's concerns. He insisted that Mrs. Durand-Deacon had not, in fact, kept her appointment with him. He had not seen her, he said, since Friday morning. By Sunday, there was still no sign of the missing woman. Haig and Mrs. Lane went to the police with their worries. An investigation was opened. Police suspicion soon turned on Haig. His workshop in Crawley was searched. On the floor, packed with straw, were several large chemical containers. They were empty. In a briefcase, police found a gun, along with passports and ration cards in names they did not recognize. Tucked among the papers and an envelope of ammunition was one other thing: a receipt from a firm of cleaners in Reigate. It was for a woman's black Persian lamb coat.
Mrs. Durand-Deacon no longer exists. She has disappeared. I have destroyed her with acid. You should see your face, Inspector. Isn't he a sight?
You are saying that you have disposed of Mrs. Durand-Deacon with acid?
Sulfuric acid, yes. You will find the sludge that remains outside my workshop on Leopold Road.
Haig hoisted the body of Olive Durand-Deacon into a large drum, which he then filled with sulfuric acid. Within a few days, all that remained of Mrs. Durand-Deacon were the fatty sludge and plastic handbag which had resisted corrosion. Haig disposed of it all in the yard outside his workshop.
He bent the body in half and pushed her bottom first into the oil drum. That's when he pumped in the sulfuric acid. He got rid of the jewellery and the furs and got money for those. He went to a nearby pub, had lunch, and went back, and he started continuing to destroy the body.
He tried to make sure he dissolved her in these wretched drums, and after about 48 hours he more or less achieved that. But he had no drain to put down the remains, so he just sloshed everything in the backyard. But there was a lot of junk and mess, and he thought, well, if I tip it out there, it'll never be noticed.
He tipped out the contents of the oil drum on the waste ground at the side, and there were still parts of her that hadn't been destroyed. Her dentures weren't affected by the sulfuric acid. There were bone fragments, particularly one of her heels was left. And most crucially of all, Olive Durand-Deacon had gallstones. He tipped these stones out, put them on the waste ground, not really realising that to a pathologist, gallstones look very different to small pebbles.
Possibly had they been left in the acid for long enough, they might have disappeared completely, but the fact that this was tipped out of the barrel may have contributed to them surviving intact.
It's quite a simple process, really. Once you've mastered it, at any rate.
What do you mean?
Well, that's how I disposed of the others too, you see.
What others?
Haig's first victim was William McSwan. They first met in 1937. Haig was employed briefly as William's chauffeur and seemed to thrive in the work. But of course, it could not support his more extravagant tastes. His expensive cars, tailored suits, and relentless gambling were soon funded instead through criminal endeavour. Those led to prison. But Haig was not forgotten by his one-time employer. William visited him behind bars, and the pair would meet for drinks after Haig's release. On the 9th of September 1944, the friends met at the Goat pub on Kensington High Street, as they had several times before. William had no idea of what Haig had planned for him this time, however.
From the Goat, I took Mac back to Gloucester Road. I had a basement flat there, number 79, opposite the tube. The moment I closed the door behind us, I gave him a little tap on the head with a cosh. They say it's difficult to kill someone, don't they? But people are such dimwits. It's as easy a thing as falling off a log. Mac was dead within 5 minutes or so. It's the bodies. That's where you have to be clever. That's where a gentleman shows his real skill.
So, you dissolved Mr. McSwan in acid?
Exactly as I did Mrs. Durand Deacon, yes. Though I was quite the amateur that first time. I didn't even have a mask, would you believe? Well, I nearly choked on the fumes.
Well, that would have been unfortunate.
I had to keep going for fresh air. In, out, in, out.
So once the body had dissolved, what did you do then?
There was a drain in the basement. A jolly handy thing, too. It all washed straight into the river.
The petty crimes of John George Haig had escalated. In a few years, he had gone from fraud and minor offences to the most heinous misdemeanour, murder. His friend and work colleague, William McSwan, was his first victim. But Haig, unlike most killers, had devised a foolproof way of dispatching his victims. Or so he thought. With the body of William McSwan disposed of, the only loose end was William's parents, Donald and Amy. Haig told them their son had gone on the run to avoid conscription into the army. They had every reason to believe him. After all, when the Second World War began, William had registered as a conscientious objector, and he had lived in constant fear of being called up. Haig had graduated from petty criminal to murderer. The motive behind his crimes remained the same, however. Haig emptied William's bank account and sold what valuables he found on the body. But the money would not last forever. Nor would the war. By this time, Allied victory over Germany was certain. It was just a question of when. Of course, when the war ended, there would be no reason for William McSwan to hide. With funds running low and the excuse for William's absence disappearing, Haig turned his attention to the parents.
I don't think the monetary reward was huge from his first victim. He did start taking money out of McSwan's bank account, but that was limited because a lot of the business side of McSwan's business was actually with his parents. So I think Haig got so far with it and then decided probably if he was going to pursue this line, then it may have to be McSwan's parents.
Early in 1945, he bought 30 gallons of sulfuric acid. All he had to do then was lure the couple to the flat in Gloucester Road. On Monday, the 2nd of July 1945, Haig brought first the 67-year-old Donald, then the 62-year-old Amy, to the basement flat. One after another, he battered them to death before placing them, like their son, in a vat of acid.
Neither of them had any apprehension of what was to happen. I made sure of that. They felt no fear.
I see. So, after you beat them to death, I take it dissolving their bodies in acid was your next act of kindness?
I am not a cruel man, Inspector. I was never cruel to any of them.
Just answer the question, John.
I am a very kind person. I often go out of my way for others. And it's very rarely reciprocated, I might add.
So, what did you do next? You put them in a tank of acid?
Separate tanks, yes.
And how long does this take, the process?
It depends on their size and build, the water content of their bodies, that sort of thing. It generates a tremendous amount of heat. Did you know that?
No, I did not.
The chemical reaction. It's quite an extraordinary thing to watch.
He was a charmer, he was articulate, he could just about persuade them of anything. So he dealt with the parents in exactly the same way as he'd dealt with the son. Take them up one by one to the basement, hit them on the back of the head and dissolve the bodies in acid.
By now, he had realised that he couldn't dispose of the bodies by not protecting himself, and this is when he'd already got hold of thick gloves, rubber boots, a thick rubber apron, and of course was wearing a gas mask. This is what we come now to see as the quintessential image of the acid bath killer in practice.
After the McSwans had been killed, he went to a solicitor's office posing as the son and gained power of attorney over the properties and over their finances. Altogether, he made roughly about £8,000 to £9,000. He actually signed the paperwork in the presence of witnesses, and amazingly got away with it all.
Haig felt unstoppable. He thought he had devised the perfect method of murder, for if there was no body, who could say there had ever been a crime? He was so clever, so cunning. It was only a shame he couldn't boast about it. With the proceeds of his crimes, Haig bought a flash new car and gambled recklessly with bookmakers across London. He soon burned through the money.
I was rather pinched for cash, but that is the life of the businessman, the entrepreneur, ups and downs. Most can't cope with it, but it's all part of the thrill. Anyway, it was during one of those down months I met the Hendersons. They were the next ones. Archie, Dr. Henderson. His wife was Rosalie, second wife, a decade younger. They had a hell of a marriage. The things she told me.
So, when was this exactly? You said 1947?
Summer. Late summer. Do say if I'm going too fast for you, Inspector.
No, go on.
They were interesting people. Amusing. Fond of expensive parties. Oh, they had this lovely dog. This little red setter called Pat. He was a dear thing. Blind, it turned out.
How was it that you met them, the Hendersons?
It was a stroke of luck, really. I answered an ad in the paper. They had this place up for sale in Ladbroke Square, and I expressed an interest.
Haig offered to buy the property for £10,500. He had just £26, however, in his bank account. The introduction was just what he wanted. Like Haig, Archibald and Rosalie Henderson had extravagant tastes. Unlike him, they could more easily afford it. Their marriage was an unstable one, however. Archibald was a drunk, and Rosalie was a hypochondriac.
The way he got friendly with them was through music, because of his piano playing, the organ playing, and it was this love of music which brought the three of them together.
He ingratiated himself into their lives. They were great socialites. They were wealthy and loved parties. He fitted the part completely with his smart suits, and he would walk their dog, Pat. And so it was quite easy to enter the Hendersons' way of life.
It became clear after a while that although he said he wanted the house, he really wasn't going to buy it. He admitted to them he didn't have the money for it, but by that time he ingratiated himself so far into the family. The one thing about this is that Archie himself, when he got drunk, he had a bit of a temper on him. And he thought, rightly or wrongly, that Haig was trying to move in on his wife. Haig was actually setting all this up. He was deliberately trying to draw a wedge between them as all part of his long-standing scheme to give himself an excuse, a story for when he killed them later on.
It was in Haig's workshop in Leopold Road in Crawley that Olive Durand-Deacon would be murdered in cold blood. But the previous year, it was where he had lured Mr. and Mrs. Henderson.
I took Dr. Henderson to the workshop first. I shot him in the head.
With the weapon that we recovered from Leopold Road?
The Enfield service revolver, that's right. He was in the army, or the medical corps at any rate.
So it was his gun?
I took it from their house.
So you walk into the workshop and you shoot Dr. Henderson in the head?
Yes. I then put him in a tank, of course, and went to fetch Rosalie. I told her Archie had been taken ill, that it was an emergency. I then shot her in the head as well.
Haig dumped the dissolved remains of the couple in the yard outside. He then sent letters to their friends and family, impersonating the couple and saying they'd gone overseas. Once again, he forged deeds of transfer for their property and took money from their tenants. This time, however, his victims were missed.
They were socialites, they had relatives, and they had friends. He still managed that by saying that there'd been a few money troubles and that they had taken off for South Africa. The person that was hardest to convince about this was Arnold Berlin.
Rose Henderson's brother was very, very suspicious and wanted to know what was happening. And Haig said Dr. Henderson had committed an illegal abortion and there was a danger of him being arrested. That was the cover story.
There are some amazing letters forged by Haig to Berlin, written as from Rose mostly, copying her handwriting and suggesting that Haig has been such a wonderful friend, you know, do look after him, but we're off to South Africa, everything is just fine, you know.
Rose's brother got particularly concerned when a letter supposedly came from the Hendersons saying that they owed Haig £2,500, and if it wasn't paid within a couple of months, then their car and their house was due to be given to him in lieu of payment. This sounded very suspicious.
Arnold was not convinced by the letters and telegrams he received. He came to London to search. But his suspicions never landed on Haig, even when Arnold spotted his sister's address book in the man's car. Haig just seemed too helpful, too nice, too plausible. Arnold eventually gave up. Haig's narrow escape only made him more reckless. Haig began 1948 with more than £7,000 in his bank account. That's over $250,000 in today's money. But by early 1949, he was in debt again with his bank. He owed money to countless bookmakers and was well behind in rent at the Onslow Court Hotel. Haig was confident he would find a solution, however. Many of his fellow residents at the Onslow Court Hotel were wealthy women, after all. Mrs. Durand Deacon, the widow from room 115, was not the first resident Haig targeted, but she was the first who agreed to accompany him to Crawley and his dank workshop there.
John...
Over a period of 5 years, Haig killed them all before dissolving their bodies in acid. Several of the victims were Haig's friends, but that was no protection for them. Haig's only interest was in the money he could earn from them. There were means to an end. Their ends became his means. Haig thought he was better than other people, and certainly cleverer than the police interviewing him. He may have confessed to the killings, but he had no intention of hanging for them.
Would you like a magazine?
No, I'm quite all right.
I don't know how long it'll be.
What is dear Inspector Symes up to?
Well, John, like all of us, he's working very hard to get you hanged.
But what on earth for?
What's the one thing we hang men for in this country?
But you can't prove anything. There's no body.
We don't need a body to prove murder.
Yes. You do.
Trust me, we don't.
They don't hang insane men, do they?
You're not insane, John.
But what if a man is found guilty of murder, but the jury is convinced that he's insane?
Then they send him to Broadmoor, to the asylum for criminal lunatics.
Does anyone ever get out?
The legal definition of insanity to reduce a murder charge is that you have to be incapable of a criminal intent to actually commit that crime, and it's quite a strong test.
The person is insane, it's because they are of brute nature or have an infant's nature and don't know what they are doing is wrong. It's quite as simple as that. So it's not until the 19th century you get this formulation.
Claiming insanity was Haig's last throw of the dice. If he could convince everyone he was not in sound mind, he may just escape execution.
That's the lot, is it? William McSwan, his parents Donald and Amy, the Hendersons, Mrs. Durand Deacon. Is there nothing else you want to tell us?
There was one other thing. I drank their blood.
You what?
After I killed them, I made an incision in their necks, drained their blood, and then I drank it.
Haig's trial began on the 18th of July, 1949. Charged with the murder of Mrs. Durand Deacon, he pleaded not guilty. But his defense would not deny that Haig had committed the murders. Instead, they would argue that he was insane, and an asylum should be his destination rather than the gallows. The case would turn on one question. Did Haig meet the legal definition of insanity? His destiny would be shaped by an obscure case from over a century earlier. Daniel Macnaghten was a Scottish woodturner. In 1843, he attempted to assassinate Robert Peel, the British Prime Minister. On the afternoon of the 20th of January, he waited near Downing Street until he spotted his target. Macnaghten then walked up behind him, drew a pistol, and fired at point-blank range. But Macnaghten had been mistaken. It was not at the Prime Minister he shot, but a civil servant named Edward Drummond. Drummond died 5 days later, and Macnaghten was put on trial for murder. But he escaped the death penalty. His defense convinced the court that Macnaghten was suffering from delusions. He was cleared. The verdict provoked outrage in Britain. Judges were summoned by the House of Lords to explain the decision. Their answers would define the law on insanity for the next century and more. The judges told the House of Lords that a defendant could claim insanity if they satisfied one of two criteria. Either the defendant did not know what they were doing, or if they did know what they were doing, they did not know it was wrong. The judges' answers became known as the Macnaghten Rules.
I dare say that there were some people who were convicted of murder and perhaps hanged when they might have been mentally disordered. The Macnaghten Rules did actually kind of establish a proper legal judgment and precedent of this day.
That was the basis of Haig's defence, the Macnaghten Rules, which of course still operate today. In fact, they operate in very, very many countries. That is still the basic rule.
His defence, Sir David Maxwell Fyfe, offered little cross-examination. All would rest on the evidence of their own witness, Dr. Henry Yellowlees. Yellowlees was one of 3 psychiatrists who had examined Haig on behalf of the defence, but he was the only one who thought him potentially insane. According to Yellowlees, Haig suffered from paranoia and delusions of serving some higher power.
Dr. Yellowlees took a long time going through all the psychiatric evidence and said in his view Haig was paranoid, but the only thing he was not prepared to say is whether Haig knew or not whether he was doing something legally wrong.
Nobody was fooled by these claims of drinking blood and forests of crucifixes and things like that. It had clearly been a ploy by Haig, who was a clever man, to convince them other than the truth.
The prosecution were quick to remind the court that Haig had planned the killings, destroyed evidence, and profited from the assets of the dead. He knew what he was doing. The jury agreed. Fittingly, for a man whose lofty opinion of himself was never backed up by actual achievement, Haig's last scheme failed. He was found guilty of murder and sentenced to death. At Wandsworth Prison in London on the 10th of August 1949, John George Haig was hanged. He was buried within the prison grounds. There was a body and a grave for the acid bath murderer, more than he'd ever granted his victims. Sunday, the 31st of May, 1953. The coronation of Elizabeth II was just days away. Visitors from all across the world were filling London, and the city was in the mood for a party. It could do with one. Many districts still bore the scars of the Blitz. Others were shabby with post-war austerity. And memories were fresh of the great smog that had cloaked London the previous December. The freak weather event had trapped filthy air over the city and killed thousands.
London was getting ready for the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II. So the newspapers were, of course, full of all those royal events.
This was when the whole country was excited, focused on the coronation, which was moving towards a whole new era, because you had a young queen, you had the hope of a new Elizabethan age, you had the hope that finally we were moving away from the austerities of war.
England was coming out of just about the Depression. Rationing was still in force, but it was lessening. More and more things were becoming available.
There was a great sense of jubilation. It was party time, and I have to say I remember it because I just entered my teens, and I can remember all the fun and things that were going on.
The country was enjoying an extended spell of warm and dry weather. In the West London town of Teddington, the public swimming pool was packed, and down by the river, dozens of young people had set up camp in a vast, undeveloped area of meadows and gravel pits.
Teddington Lock is the point where the Thames, having travelled 96 miles, stops being a tidal river. This is where it all changes at Teddington Lock.
The towpath and the banks, there were a whole series of people camping at a weekend.
Campsites like that up and down the Thames were extremely popular. It was a way of breaking monotony and routine.
It was freedom they were getting now after the restrictions which there had been during the war and certainly for years afterwards.
Why not take what seems to have been an absolutely beautiful weekend to go and do some camping?
Among the revelers that warm Sunday evening were 3 teenage boys. The friends had camped by the river a few hundred yards from Teddington Lock. They were later joined by 2 local girls, Barbara Songhurst and Christine Reed.
These were just good-hearted, cheerful, modern young women enjoying life, looking forward to the coronation. Barbara was going to appear in a bathing beauty contest to mark the coronation.
They came from working class families. It was a sort of fairly local community. They had been friends for some length of time. They were around together in the cafes and cinemas a great deal of the time.
They were church-going, they were virtuous, they were respectable, modern young girls.
On Sunday, the 31st of May, the girls decided to take advantage of the clement weather and set off on their bikes toward the rural area around Teddington Lock.
Barbara was staying with Christine, and one of them had known 3 boys who were setting up a tent and a camping site on the river bank, and the girls took their bicycles out, rode over to see them,
There'd obviously been a lot of playing around. The boys had hidden the girls' bicycles. They'd been chasing and they'd been kissing, and it was teenage fun.
The girls came back to Christine's for lunch, rode out again, came back for tea, and rode out again in the evening.
The warm, bright night was enticing. The teenagers left the Reed House again at 8 p.m. and cycled back to the boys' camp by the river. They stayed there until almost midnight. Then, with a cheerful goodbye, they cycled off into the darkness.
See you tomorrow. See ya. Night. Christine? You all right? Christine?
On the 1st of June, men from the Port of London Authority arrived at Teddington to perform repairs on the river embankment. They were working 800 yards downstream of the lock. At 8:15 a.m., they spotted something in the water. It was the body of a teenage girl. Police examination found she'd been the victim of a savage attack. She'd been struck over the head with an axe and stabbed repeatedly in the chest. The girl had also been sexually assaulted before her body was dumped in the river. The victim was Barbara Songhurst.
The body was noticed floating in the river by a passing cyclist who cast his eye across the river and saw something strange, realised that it was a body, raised the alarm and brought the police in.
She'd been terribly assaulted and battered and raped. And of course that then started off a murder hunt.
Detective Superintendent Herbert Hannam of Scotland Yard opened a murder investigation. Bert Hannam was a Londoner. He was a short man, but stiff-backed and broad-shouldered. He was an imposing figure all the same. There was something aristocratic in his bearing, which he enhanced with dapper suits and smart gloves. Press and colleagues nicknamed him the Count.
The investigation started with Herbert Hannam, a detective superintendent from Scotland Yard, very experienced detective.
Hannam said he was going to search the river and wanted it dammed, and apparently, according to the Daily Express, 20,000 people came to watch.
The murder scene was soon found. Teddington Lock. Blood stained the gravel of the towpath. There was more splashed over the grass and soaked into the earth nearby. Hannam had no doubt. This was where the young woman was attacked. Scattered in the wild undergrowth beyond the footpath, they found first one pair of women's shoes, but then another. Police were in no doubt that these belonged to Christine Reed. 2 days later, Christine's bike was recovered from the Thames. It would be another 4 days, however, before Christine herself would be found. On the 6th of June, a week after the murders, the police team dragging the river reached Glover's Island. It was there, 2 miles downstream from Teddington Lock, that Christine's body was discovered. Like Barbara, she too had suffered blunt head injuries. She had been stabbed over 10 times and brutally raped as she died. The violence of the attacks shocked even experienced police. Chief Inspector Hannam's investigation soon became one of the largest murder hunts England had seen for years. The press, fed by twice-daily police briefings, followed every development. The search involved dogs, mine detectors, and draining part of the river. But no trace of the murder weapon was found, and Barbara's bicycle remained missing. Police feared the killer had fled abroad. The press speculated he would soon strike again. A week after the gruesome murder, a 49-year-old woman was walking her dogs alone in Windsor Great Park when she was grabbed by a man. He told her he had a knife and knew how to use it. He tried to drag her into the bushes, but she struggled. Her attacker gave up and fled the scene on a bicycle. The woman later described to the police the powerfully built young man who had assaulted her.
The News of the World put up a £1,000 reward for information. It must have been a local man. It was a man who was an expert knife thrower. Also, he had a cleft chin, and this was starting to match up with the identification of the woman who'd been raped.
It's not just the police who are instituting their inquiries, going house to house. It's the reporters doing it as well. So they are interrogating all the young men of the area, saying, who do you think did it? Who do you think did it? That's where one of them is prompted in to say, well, if you're looking for a suspect, the kind of person I would expect is that chap there. He's a bad lot.
The officers found the man as promised on Oxshott Heath. His name was Alfred Whiteway. He was 22 years old. The police asked him to accompany them for questioning. They placed Whiteway alone in the back of the car and drove him to Kingston Police Station. He was searched and questioned. The questioning came to nothing. Whiteway was released. But he would soon come to the attention of Herbert Hannam and was hauled in and questioned again, this time by Hannam himself.
I'll save you the time. When that job was done, I was with my wife.
What time was that? The job?
11, wasn't it? I read it in the paper.
Well, tell me more about it then.
Well, all I can tell you is that I was indoors with the missus until 11:30, so it couldn't be me now, could it?
How do you know you were indoors until 11:30?
I know I was. I talked about it with the wife.
You talked about it with her?
Yeah, she'll tell you.
Why were the two of you discussing your whereabouts?
'Cause she asked me.
You said you were with her. Were you not together?
Yeah.
Then why did she ask you where you were?
I don't know, do I?
Whiteway came from an impoverished background. He was born in London on the 21st of June, 1931. His mother was a domestic servant. His father would die of cancer when he was just 14. From a young age, Whiteway had trouble with the law. As a teenager, he appeared repeatedly before juvenile court and was sent to a reform school near Swindon. But his poor behaviour continued there, with the headmaster describing his conduct as most unsatisfactory.
You could describe it as a very poor household. I think he'd got 8 brothers and sisters, one of whom, the police reports describe as mentally defective.
He was very poorly educated, and the suspicion must be that that was because either he had some kind of learning difficulties which were not identified, or that he was inattentive, disinclined to learn. He was certainly not interested in reading or anything like that.
After a stint in prison for theft in 1948, Whiteway found work in construction. Fellow labourers remembered his great strength. They said he could climb scaffolding using his arms alone. Others recalled his temper and his obsession with knives.
Throwing axes, machetes, hatchets, whatever came to hand, gave him a status that he was never going to have without it.
He was married to a girl called Nellie. He'd apparently seen her more or less in the street and followed her and started chatting her up. Her mother, very sensibly, didn't approve of Whiteway at all. He was apparently fairly a silent person, and what they did was they deliberately got pregnant. So mother would be forced to allow her to get married. She wouldn't allow him in the house. So they sat on the step, or if mother went out, he came in, and the relationship was consummated with sex in the alley.
By May 1953, Whiteway was a married man with a little girl not yet 2 and a second child on the way. He did not live with his wife and child, however. His in-laws disapproved of him, and he was forced to live with his mother, uncle and siblings in a cramped, terraced house on Sydney Street in Teddington. It was less than a mile from the scene of the double murder. There was something about Whiteway's unusual domestic setup which prompted Hannam to dig a little deeper into his supposed movements on the night of the murders.
So, you left your wife's home at 11:30 p.m. and then cycled to your mother's?
Yeah.
Which way did you go?
Usual way. Over Kingston Bridge, Sandy Lane.
Did anyone see you leave your wife's house?
No.
Did anyone see you on the bridge?
No.
Did anyone see you at Sandy Lane?
Look, no one saw me until I got home, all right?
Of course. It was late. But someone did see you when you got home then?
Yeah, my Uncle Charlie.
He'll be able to confirm that, will he?
Yeah. I got in just before 12. He'll know. He looked at the clock.
Very well.
There was no rush to secure a confession. Whiteway was being held on remand for the assault in Windsor Park, and he had already admitted the violent rape of a teenage girl earlier that year. Hannam compared Whiteway's alibi with statements given by his wife and mother-in-law. There were countless discrepancies. Whiteway's account of his movements on the night of the murders was falling apart. In the summer of 1953, police in London were investigating a double murder. 2 teenage girls had been sexually assaulted and killed on the towpath at Teddington Lock. Their bodies were thrown into the river, where they were found days later. The police's prime suspect was Alfred Whiteway. He was being held in custody on charges of sexual assault, and his story as to his whereabouts on the night of the murder was just not adding up. Chief Inspector Hannam was slowly but surely building a case against Whiteway.
What were you wearing that night?
Shirt, gabardine trousers, the ones the police took, the green ones.
What else?
A rain jacket. And these shoes.
We'll have to take a look at those too.
While the interrogation of Whiteway continued, police, along with the pathology team, were building up a criminal profile and identified that their suspect would have had a keen interest in knives and possibly a talent for throwing them. This theory was consistent with the wounds suffered by both Barbara Songhurst and Christine Reed.
There were wounds on her skull, which indicate that he used the axe. He proceeded to rape both his victims and subsequently stab them.
They were stabbed and they were both axed. There were stab wounds in the back, and this led to a theory that he had thrown a knife at Barbara.
Possibly both girls were murdered because Whiteway recognised Barbara Songhurst and thought that she might identify him. She was working as a chemist's assistant in a local shop, so possibly that's where she had seen him or he had seen her.
We have to speculate that Alfie realised he had miscalculated, that he hadn't stopped a completely unknown girl, that she had a companion, and that companion was known to him. And more than that, she knew and would be able to identify him. They were in the wrong place at the wrong time.
It was the sexual assaults on the victims which led Hannam to Whiteway. A series of rapes and attempted rapes had plagued the area at the time. Whiteway had been identified as the perpetrator and charged by a separate police unit. On learning of Whiteway's crimes, Hannam had decided to question him about the murders. After already several attempts at trying to crack Whiteway, Hannam could not have imagined how tough he would be to convict. Further interviews followed on the 3rd, 8th and 15th of July, and everyone Whiteway denied involvement in the murders. His home was searched, but no trace of the murder weapons was found. Hannam was sure he had his man, but he still didn't have the evidence he needed to be sure of a conviction.
This is Hannam. He has been moved now. He's at Brixton. We're waiting on the test results first. Yes? Yes, sir. Precisely. Come in. Well, if there's a semen match, if there's blood on the shoes, well, then I think it all adds up. My apologies. May I call you back? Thank you.
Just came for us, sir. You won't believe where it's been.
Hannam was convinced he had the murder weapon, but to be sure, it was sent away for forensic investigation, a lengthy process in those days. The circumstances of how the axe was found, however, would negate any hard evidence to link it to the attack.
The axe is a really terrible story of neglect and misconduct.
By that time, the police had discovered that they actually had the murder weapon, but they didn't know they had the murder weapon. After being arrested on suspicion of being a rapist, Alfie seems to have stuck the axe under the seat in the police car.
Police were distracted in the front of the car. They hadn't searched him properly.
He somehow took it out from his overalls and hid it. A police officer did actually find it and put it in his locker, and the significance of this axe was not apparent for quite a few days.
The police officer went off sick and took it home when he came back and used it to chop wood, and he blunted it very substantially. And it's only about a week after that that someone starts making inquiries. He says, "Oh, I've got the axe at home. I'll bring it in." And I think it's right to say he had his knuckles rapped very sharply.
While the axe was being tested, Hannam continued with his hard line of interrogation to elicit a confession.
Do you know where these girls were murdered, Mr. Whiteway? Mr. Whiteway?
Look, I'm keeping my bloody mouth shut.
You seem afraid, Alfred.
I'm not letting you lot pin this one on me.
You had nothing to do with it. What's there to be afraid of?
Because I know what you bloody coppers are like. Yeah. I'll go any distance to get a bit from a girl, but not that far. You're wasting your time. Bloke that did that job is mad.
Whiteway's clothing had been sent for forensic testing. By modern standards, this was basic. Although the structure of DNA had been discovered that year by Francis Crick, James Watson, and Rosalind Franklin, it would be decades before genetic profiling could help police investigators. What could be detected in 1953, however, was the presence of blood. And it was blood which would become crucial in the investigation of the Towpath murders. But would it be enough? Hannam would find that in constructing a watertight case against Whiteway, his ethics would be tested, and police conduct would come into close scrutiny. Chief Inspector Hannam was frustrated. His investigation into the murders of Barbara Songhurst and Christine Reed had been a long and exhausting one. Now, at least he had a suspect in custody, Alfred Whiteway, a 22-year-old labourer who lived less than a mile from the murder scene. There was no doubt Whiteway was a violent predator. He had already confessed to attacking other women. But there was no direct evidence tying him to the double murder. The axe, mislaid by Kingston police, was now near useless as evidence. The knife used in the attack had still not been found, and no witnesses placed Whiteway at the scene of the crime. Hannam knew the case was a weak one. What he needed was a confession. By this time, Whiteway had been moved to Brixton Prison, awaiting trial for the sexual assault charges. Hannam continued his interrogation there.
I told you this already. I had a row with the wife, and I didn't leave her until 11:30.
Was your wife's mother in when you left?
How the devil do I know? I don't go in the house. She hates me.
I see. I can tell you your wife's mother was there that night. And she insists your wife was in bed by 11 p.m.
Well, she is a bloody liar. I was with my wife at 11:30. We had a cup of tea on the back step.
Very well. We've spoken before about your shoes. Your crepe sole shoes.
Yeah?
You said you were wearing them on the night of the 31st of May. Is that correct?
I've already said so, ain't I?
So you were wearing those shoes?
Look, it's the same bloody questions. I've already told you.
Yes or no?
Yes.
I see. Did you ever get blood on either of them?
No.
Is there any reason at all why there might be bloodstains on them?
No.
Very well. I must tell you, Mr. Whiteway, your shoes have been examined. A scientific expert will say in court that one of them has been exposed to a great quantity of blood.
Well, if they're saying that, then they're liars. Ain't got no blood on them.
Hannam pretty well breaks him on that basis. So you were wearing those shoes, weren't you? They were also known as brothel creepers at the time. They were not something that respectable young men really wore.
They discovered traces of blood on Alfred Whiteway's shoes. And really, those traces of blood were crucial evidence.
He'd apparently washed them, but done nothing more than that.
There was enough to suggest that there was blood which had been washed, but there was enough to suggest that there were some stains.
Hannam had one more ace up his sleeve. He had the axe, examination of which showed the curve of the blade matched the head wounds suffered by Barbara and Christine. Hannam knew this would be enough to unsettle Whiteway further.
You're very fond of knives, aren't you, Mr. Whiteway?
I didn't kill them girls.
Axes, too. Anything sharp, is that not right?
Were you kidding about that blood being on my shoe?
No.
What a bloody mess.
According to Inspector Hannam, it was at this point that Whiteway finally cracked. He told police he could not control himself around women. He confessed to killing Barbara and Christine. On the 20th of August, he was charged with their murders. The 9-week-long investigation was at an end. Over 1,600 statements had been taken and 2,000 telephone messages received. But the mistakes made by police at Kingston and the failure of Hannam's team to find the murder weapon undermined the case against Whiteway. It would all rest on the confession. Whiteway's trial began on the 26th of October 1953. The confession secured by Hannam became the battleground in court. Defense barrister Peter Rawlinson subjected the chief inspector to a grueling 2-day cross-examination. It was, in the words of one newspaper, the duel at the Old Bailey. Rawlinson accused Hannam of manufacturing Whiteway's statement and tricking the young man into signing it.
Whiteway said that he never made this statement. What happened was that he was given a set of sheets of paper. He was asked to sign them and told where to put his signature. But he's saying, in effect, that he was verbaled.
Verbaling is what is called noble cause corruption. If the police know, quote, know, unquote, that somebody has done something and there isn't the evidence to back it up, they don't think they're doing anything wrong by helping convict a man whom they know did it. And this would be perhaps sometimes planting a bit of evidence on them. In this case, it was just the verbal confession.
The whole defence was questioning the integrity of the admission of guilt that he made when he was confronted with the axe and the bloodstains on his shoe.
This line of defence that the prisoner has been verbal is not unique. What sometimes happens is that the prisoner makes a statement, not realising the full significance of everything he or she is saying. And it's only when this has been pointed out to them by their solicitor or defence counsel that then they come up with their defence, this is a false confession.
Police interviews were not recorded at this time. The only evidence to corroborate Whiteway's confession was Hannam's notebook and those of the other officers present. This was standard practice. It was not until 1991 that tape recording of interviews by British police became the norm. Hannam, of course, denied Rawlinson's accusations. He called the suggestion of police misconduct terrible and absolutely untrue. The judge and many onlookers criticised Rawlinson's approach.
There was nothing else that Rawlinson really had to work on. He couldn't stand up and say, my character is a pillar of the community. So the only thing you can do is discredit the police case. And that is what Rawlinson does his best to do. And actually, by all accounts, did a pretty good job.
Jury was out, 45 minutes, I think, under the hour. And one of the interesting things is they sent in a question saying, when Hannam produced the axe, how long did he have it on the table before Whiteway? And when Whiteway signed the confession, had he still got it on the table? Presumably because that would have intimidated Whiteway. But if he'd put the axe away, then there was nothing for Whiteway to be scared about.
What undermined the effectiveness of that part of the defence was that Alfie was such a bad lot, and so clearly such a bad lot, that the jury overlooked what otherwise, in another case, could have brought the prosecution case crashing down.
At the end of the 6-day trial, they found Whiteway guilty. He was sentenced to death. Following the trial, there was outcry over the tactics of the defense. For many, questioning the word of a police officer was beyond the pale. But in decades to come, the skepticism expressed by Rawlinson in court would spread. Bribery and corruption scandals engulfed elements of the London police in the 1970s. Internal investigations discovered police profiting from crime they were meant to be preventing. Officers took bribes, ensured charges against guilty men were dropped, and fabricated evidence against the innocent.
His appeal was not successful. The only grounds for appeal in the English criminal justice system is that the law has in some ways not been properly followed through, that the case has been improperly handled, that evidence has been suppressed. Rawlinson's appeal was on the basis, it had to be on the basis, not that the jury was mistaken, but that the confession was forced out of him. It's actually perfectly possible that that is the case, but it was held by the court, by Lord Chief Justice Goddard, that there wasn't grounds for an appeal.
There was no general outcry as there was, for example, with Ruth Ellis and other cases. No, he was not regarded with any sympathy at all. And if he's convicted of 2 rapes and murders of girls, and the other rape and the attempted rape were left on the file, there's not a lot of room for sympathy.
Whiteway was not innocent. He was a violent sex attacker. Had he not been caught, he would certainly have assaulted and possibly killed others. But we will never know whether he confessed to the murders of Barbara and Christine in the way police claim. Alfred Whiteway hanged on the 22nd of December 1953. A few years later, after his retirement from Scotland Yard, Bert Hannam had advice for his former colleagues. Police, he said, should have the courage to do things the law forbids. What mattered to Hannam was seeing justice done, however it was reached. But no justice can truly compensate for 2 teenage girls who left home one Sunday morning with all their lives ahead of them and never returned. On the morning of the 13th of July, 1955, Ruth Ellis was readied for execution in the condemned cell at Holloway Prison. She dressed in her own clothes, ate a small breakfast under the supervision of her female guards, and counted down the few minutes remaining before 9 a.m.
There was outrage at the execution. There were a lot of persons who didn't agree with it.
Thousands of people signed a petition asking and begging for Ruth Ellis to be reprieved.
There were lots of people who wrote personally to the Home Secretary expressing their feelings about the case.
The judge himself wrote to the Home Secretary saying that he should consider giving a reprieve.
The public, generally speaking, did not like to see women being executed.
There were some people who thought she got what she deserved and that she was a cold-blooded killer.
Ruth Ellis was at the forefront of public consciousness, and petitions to halt her execution had been organized by passionate members of the public. They took it upon themselves to gain as many signatures as possible in the hope that the Home Secretary would grant a reprieve. Many were still out on the morning of the execution, tirelessly collecting signatures. For in their eyes, the justice system which had served the country for centuries was not fit for this modern era.
Hello, sir. Would you like to sign this petition? Hello. Would you like to sign this petition? It's for Ruth Ellis. Hello, sir. Sign the petition for Ruth Ellis. Hello. Would you like to sign this petition? Hello, sir. Would you like to sign this petition? It's against the hanging of Ruth Ellis. Hello, ladies. Did you know that Ruth Ellis actually had a 10-year-old boy? Hello, sir. Sign the petition for Ruth Ellis.
Ticket, please, sir.
I do apologise, I've only just bought it.
That's quite all right, sir. We're running late anyway.
Oh, really?
Signal failure. We may be here for some time, sir.
Oh. I never put it in there.
Always losing things in pockets myself. Thank you, sir.
It's one of those mornings for all of us, it seems.
At least we know someone's having a worse day. Tickets, please.
Hello, Mum. Are you against hanging? Hello, sir. Sign the petition for Ruth Ellis. Sign the petition.
Sorry?
The petition for Ruth Ellis.
It's a little late, isn't it? You'll be hanged in 15 minutes.
Yeah, but it's to tell the government how people feel.
Sorry.
What's being done to her is a disgrace. Tell me why you and everyone else on this train thinks it's all right to hang a 28-year-old mum.
Well, Mrs. Ellis had a fair trial. And she was convicted of murder by the jury, and we hang murderers in this country. The law couldn't be clearer.
Her son is 10 years old.
And I sympathise with him.
And yet you'd still send his mum to be hanged.
You may not like it, but the law is the law. We're all born equal under it.
Do you even know where she was born?
No, I don't. I imagine it would be better for all concerned if she'd stayed there.
Ruth was born on the 9th of October 1926 in Rhyl, a working-class seaside town in North Wales. Ruth's mother was a Belgian refugee and her father played in the orchestras on Atlantic cruises. Hers was a traditional Catholic upbringing. But the stable family home Ruth was born into soon unraveled. Ruth's uncle was killed in a car crash in 1928, and her baby brother tragically died the following year. Her father numbed his grief with alcohol. He became a violent and abusive drunk. Unable to hold down a job, he uprooted the family again and again. Finally, in 1940, they moved to London.
These were the war years, so the move seemed somewhat surprising, but nonetheless it happened.
By 1944, he managed to get a job as a chauffeur in Southwark. He was lucky enough to get a flat that came with the job, so that's why they moved up there.
The teenage Ruth threw herself into London life. She didn't let the Blitz hold her back. She delighted in visiting cafes and dancing in nightclubs until the early hours. In 1943, she met a Canadian soldier called Claire Andrea McCallum and fell in love. She soon became pregnant, and McCallum asked her to marry him. Ruth began excited preparations for the wedding and their new life with the baby. What Ruth didn't know was that McCallum already had a wife and 3 children back home in Quebec. Soon after the war ended, with their son not yet 9 months old, she discovered the truth. Ruth was heartbroken. She swore she would never let another man hurt her like that again. But life for a single mother in post-war London was not easy. Jobs were scarce, and rationing was still brutal. Ruth could not afford to be picky. She responded to an advert for evening work as a model at the Camera Club near Bond Street. It was through the Camera Club that she met Maurice Conley. He posed as a respectable businessman, but was in fact the biggest vice boss in the city. He invited Ruth to become a hostess at one of his nightclubs.
London in those days was full of nightclubs. The pubs had a very strict closing times, and so nightclubs catered for the late night drinking clients. And of course it was also linked with the sex trade as well. There would be all sorts of types who would be visiting those clubs, so you never quite knew who you were dealing with.
Their clientele certainly included a lot of men who were very privileged, who were sort of upper middle class, upper class, and frequented these clubs as part of their leisure time and enjoyment.
The club owner, he actually encouraged it and encouraged relationships with the customers. This was a way of bringing more money. So there was a lot of money floating around.
Her duties at the club were simple. Look pretty, entertain guests, and have sex with whoever Conley told her to, including himself.
So she was a good time girl.
It was the work she could get.
There was no shop or factory that would take her.
What is it you do?
I work in insurance.
And how'd you get that job then?
Well, after leaving university, this was before the war, there was a connection I had with the firm.
Let me guess. A friend of your father's. Ruth's dad was an unemployable drunk.
I recognise that I was fortunate. But were there really no alternatives for her?
She tried to live respectfully. Even married a fella, for all the good it did her.
And that was Mr. Ellis, I presume?
Yeah. He was a drunk and all. And a dentist. Even worse.
So what became of him? Why didn't it last?
He bashed her about. She left.
By 1953, Ruth had a new name and a new daughter. Both were courtesy of a failed marriage to a drunk. It was in this year, too, that she first dyed her hair that famous platinum blonde. She was now Ruth Ellis, the woman who would grace 1,000 front pages. In August 1953, Ruth Ellis became manager of the Little Club in Knightsbridge. It was another Maurice Conley establishment. But Ruth was proud that at 26 years old, she was the youngest club manager in London. After a series of false starts and false hopes, Ruth's life finally seemed on track. The first customer through the door was a lean and handsome young man. He was an aspiring race car driver with the family money to match his looks. His name was David Blakely. Within 2 years, David would be dead, and Ruth would be awaiting execution in Holloway Prison for his murder.
There's a telephone. Inside. In case they change their minds, right?
Yeah, I'm certain there will be, yes. She seems quite reconciled to it, I read. As far as one can tell.
Said she wants to be together again.
With?
Yeah. With him.
Ruth Ellis started an affair with David Blakely, and I think initially they were actually sort of besotted with one another.
David Blakely was a young man who was from quite a privileged social background, more privileged than Ruth Ellis's background, from a higher social class, and obviously within the context of the time that would have been perceived as quite significant.
Ellis falls for him in a big, big way. Blakely moves in with her. It was a club lifestyle. It was drinks, it was parties. There's this tremendous sense of liberation and sort of, you can do anything. There was a certain freedom about. Domesticity was not something that was normally considered.
They enthusiastically fell in love with each other, but it wasn't long before they were each having affairs.
They were both jealous people. David still pursued other women, and Ruth was the center of attention at her club. But if their similarities caused arguments, so did the couple's differences. They came from different social worlds. David had no qualms in taking Ruth to bed, but he did not dare introduce her to his mother. And Ruth felt looked down upon by David's friends. For they were used to a social circle of the same class of people, and openly mocked the working-class girl from North Wales.
They shouldn't have been rude to her. There's no excuse for that. But I can understand if there were suspicions. Someone like him with someone like...
What? Someone like me?
They came from very different backgrounds.
So she was just some poor tart.
I didn't say that. But people were bound to wonder why they were together. Do you not believe there's the slightest possibility of some ulterior motive on her behalf?
You think she was just after his money?
Well, is it so far-fetched?
What about Desmond Cousin?
Oh, the other chap.
He was rich, he wanted to marry her. So why didn't she just go off with him if that was what she wanted?
Ruth had, in fact, met Desmond Cusson before Blakely. Cusson was on the fringes of the racing set who stalked the Little Club. the 30-year-old was shy, well-mannered, and utterly in love with Ruth. He longed to break her away from David and marry her himself.
Desmond Cousin was born and brought up in Leatherhead in Surrey. He was a rich, unassuming accountant, and he was a director of a firm of tobacconists.
Blakely encourages a relationship with Cousin, who was an ex-Lancaster pilot, and his family were in the cigarettes and retail distribution, so he had quite a bit of money. But although Ellis is willing to have an affair and become Cousin's mistress, she is still very much in love with Blakely.
By late 1954, Ruth and David's relationship had turned ugly. David soaked all his money and efforts into racing. He increasingly relied on Ruth for financial support. She gave him drinks at the Little Club and allowed him to stay in her flat free of charge.
I think when young women at her age found themselves in London, it was sometimes quite difficult for them to make their own way unless they had attached themselves to a respectable man who would give them a proper home.
One of the things that's perhaps worth remembering about Ruth is that because she had become a mother when she wasn't married and when she was young, that automatically, in the context of the time we're talking about, made life quite difficult for women. They did run the risk of losing their job if it was known that they'd had the child out of marriage. So there were a variety of other types of employment that they might need to engage in.
She definitely liked the glamour, and she loved the fast cars and mixing with rich people and the aristocracy. And during that time, she clearly felt that people appreciated her, and she was beginning to feel like a somebody.
This passionate affair would soon sour, as occasional acts of domestic violence by Blakely would become routine. The uglier and more abusive the relationship became, however, the harder it seemed for either to break free. They loved and hated one another. Their bitter arguments and passionate reconciliations swallowed up their whole lives. It destroyed Ruth's success at the Little Club, too. Customers were put off by the couple's constant public rows. Takings more than halved, infuriating the owner, Maurice Conley. In December 1954, Ruth lost her job and the flat that came with it. Homeless and jobless, she moved in temporarily with Desmond Cousin, but still she did not give up on David. The relationship continued, and so did the violence. Early in 1955, Ruth began French lessons in an attempt to impress David and his upper-class friends. The tutor later recalled her students' black eyes and bruised limbs. Ruth, she thought, was a woman on the verge of a breakdown.
I can't help questioning her taste in men.
Well, no argument there.
What I don't understand, though, is if it was as bad as you imply, with the violence and unpleasantness, the misery, why did she stay?
It's not as simple as that.
Could you not just leave him? Cut him off, never see him again?
When you know something's bad, getting away from it can seem even worse. Anyway, she couldn't. He wouldn't let her. Blakely said if she left, he'd kill her. And I reckon he would as well.
It would be Ellis, however, who would end up awaiting execution for murder. Her 2 children would be left without a mother, and all the hopes and dreams she worked towards would be destroyed. The difficult life which Ruth tried to overcome would eventually catch up with her, and all she could do is sit and wait for the inevitable end. By early 1955, the alcohol-fueled affair between Ruth Ellis and David Blakely had turned violent. The relationship had cost the 28-year-old woman her job and her home. Ruth's future with David looked grim, but she could imagine no other. In February, she left the home of her friend Desmond Cusson with her 10-year-old son and moved to a small bedsit in Kensington. She hoped David would join her there. Ruth began her new life in Egerton Gardens, and Blakely would from time to time stay, but with him came the arguments and violence. In an attempt to help Ruth, Cusson lent her money to attend a modelling course in central London. But this attempt to restart her life was soon derailed. Ruth found out she was pregnant. David was the father, but it did nothing to change the course of their relationship.
She then moved in with Desmond Cusson at Goodwood Court in his flat there. And from time to time, she did a bit of modelling with the Cherry Marshall School of Modelling. Not terribly successfully. I can remember reading a book by Cherry Marshall saying that whenever Ruth Ellis turned up, she'd got bruises all over her body.
During another drunken argument, David punched Ruth in the stomach. She lost the baby. The miscarriage made Ruth ill. As Easter approached, she was confined to bed with a fever and deeply depressed. At this stage, David's friends, Ant and Carol Findlater, decided to intervene. They'd always disliked Ruth and long urged David to end his romance with a lower-class girl. Now they resolved to keep the couple apart over the long Easter weekend.
At about 10 o'clock in the morning, on Good Friday, Blakely left their serviced room in Egerton Gardens, telling Ruth that he would be back later in the day. He didn't come back.
Blakely had gone out with some friends, and she thought that he was perhaps romantically involved with one of these friends, and she was unhappy about this. She actually herself spent the weekend with Desmond Cusson. They're both sort of spending time together, drinking quite heavily together.
In the early hours of Easter Sunday, she returned home to the tiny bedsit in Kensington. She sat in the darkness by her sleeping son and thought about her life, about her drunk and violent father, her drunk and violent husband, and her drunk and violent boyfriend. It was then that a new and peculiar feeling took hold of her. She realized she wanted to kill David.
Ruth spent a lot of time with Desmond Cusson, and it would seem that he was winding her up like a corkscrew.
It's in this point that he gives her a gun. He shows her how to shoot. And you've got to look at Cusson's motive for this. Is it a way of eliminating the rival and punishing the girl?
That evening on Easter Sunday, Ruth took her son home to Kensington. She tucked him up in bed before changing. She then kissed the boy goodnight, and telling him she wouldn't be long, slipped out of the flat. Her son would never see Ruth again. Ruth left her bedsit and travelled to Tanzer Road in Hampstead, where she believed Blakely would be. The Findlaters were hosting another party that night, but by 9 p.m, they were running low on cigarettes. David volunteered to visit the Magdala pub by Hampstead Heath Station and fetch some. He could buy more drink while he was there, too. Another partygoer, Clive Gunnell, accompanied him. the pair left in David's car for the short drive.
She watched the house. She saw David come out with his friend Gunnell, get in a car and drive away. Now the thing is that between Tanser Road, where she was, and the Magdala, where David was going to, it was a little bit of a drive. So she couldn't really have had any knowledge of where they were going. They could have been going anywhere. But when she walked back down the road, presumably she saw his car parked outside the Magdala.
Ruth lurked in the street, pacing up and down outside the pub, waiting for David to emerge. She didn't have to wait long. At 9:20 p.m., David and Clive exited the pub. David stepped over to his car, groping for his keys with 3 large bottles of beer clutched to his chest.
She fired 6 shots. 4 of them hit him directly and killed him. 1 of them missed. 1 of them ricocheted and hit a passerby.
Blakely starts running. She goes after him, fires again, he falls down. And then she stands over him and empties the gun into his back.
Ruth stepped away from the body and raised the gun to her temple. She could not pull the trigger. She lowered the revolver and fired the last round off into the pavement. Then she turned to Clive Gunnell and told him to call the police. Ruth's arrest was inevitable. An off-duty police constable, Alan Thompson, was sat in the corner of the Magdala pub when the shooting started. He pushed his way through the crowd of witnesses. Outside, he found Ruth Ellis standing over the body of her lover, David Blakely. The gun was still in her hand. Beer bottles lay shattered all around. The glass shone wet with beer and blood. Gently, the policeman took the gun away from Ruth. She did not resist. And at no point did she deny her involvement. On Easter Monday, Ruth was charged with David's murder. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, she told a policewoman. I will hang for this.
Was it the idea of parting from him that she couldn't bear?
She loved him. And he took everything from her. Then laughed about it with his mates.
But for all her unhappiness, which I recognise was considerable, this was no act of sudden passion.
Oh, she suffered abuse for years.
And had time to think. Which is my point. She took a gun and she followed Blakely. First to the house, then to this pub. And she waited for him there. For how long? What, 10 minutes? Longer? She chose to kill him. To stand closer than you and I are now and empty her gun into him.
During the Easter weekend of 1955, Ruth Ellis's life had reached breaking point. Her lover, David Blakely, had disappeared with friends, and she spent the weekend drinking with her ex-lover, Desmond Cusson. She was certain that Blakely was having an affair, and fueled by jealousy and drink, she sought him out, armed with a gun provided by Cusson. She shot Blakely multiple times and was arrested shortly after. Ruth knew her actions that fateful night would ultimately lead to her execution. Her certainty may have been misplaced. 2 decades earlier, a woman was put on trial for a similar crime. In 1932, Elvira Barney, a London socialite, was tried for the murder of her boyfriend. After a loud argument in which Elvira threatened to shoot him, he was found dead with a gunshot wound to the chest. Elvira insisted it was an accident. She was threatening suicide, she said, and her boyfriend tried to stop her. During a tussle over the weapon, the gun accidentally discharged and delivered the fatal injury. The jury believed her. She was found not guilty. Soon after the verdict, Elvira was back on the dance floor at her favorite Café de Paris in central London. "Take a good look at me," she exclaimed to the crowds. "I'm the one who shot her lover." Like Ruth, Elvira was only in her 20s. Like Ruth, she was a fixture of London nightlife. And, like Ruth, she had a tempestuous, alcohol-fueled relationship with the man killed. But unlike Ruth, Elvira was a wealthy member of the social elite. What would the court in public make of a working-class girl like Ruth? Her trial began at the Old Bailey on the 20th of June, 1955.
When she went to court, there was tremendous hostility towards her, the good time girl, the tart. And she is subjected to one of the most devastating cross-examinations ever. Prosecution counsel asked her one question. It's unique, just one question. When you stood over the body of David Blakely and fired into his body, what did you intend to do? I intended to kill him. Counsel sat down. You've got guilty intent, you've got the physical act. You don't have to prove anything more, and that is murder.
Whether it means that she wanted to be found guilty, I think, is a difficult question to answer, but she said it was obvious that she'd intended to kill him. She said this in court. And I think it shows that she was answering very honestly. Of course, that doesn't necessarily benefit you if you're on trial for murder, but she was certainly willing to give honest answers to the questions, and some of those perhaps meant that she was then perceived, certainly in relation to the criminal justice system and the legal process, quite negatively.
I don't think she had any doubts in her mind that she had intended to kill. And my guess is that in her own mind, she was justified in killing him because of the way that she perceived that he had been treating her. So I don't think that she was in any way looking to be regarded as innocent of the act of shooting him.
By then, a fiction had been presented in the press. David as the well-educated son of privilege, led astray by the peroxide blonde charms of the social climbing lower class. David's own violence and jealousy were ignored. Ruth's defense did little to correct these misconceptions. Prosecution witnesses were barely cross-examined, and Ruth's barristers seemed squeamish about revealing David's true nature. Instead, they depicted the murder as an act of typical female hysteria.
Men don't get called hysterical.
Well, not as a rule, no. But we are perhaps less prone to the... I mean...
How was David Blakely not hysterical? When he was waiting in her club all evening, picking fights with any man that even looked at her? How was George Ellis not hysterical? Calling her 10 times a day after she left. What's the difference? Because they were men? Oh no, it's a woman. She must be jealous or hysterical. Women can't control themselves when they're jealous. Her defence said that. They didn't even look into that gun. Never even asked her how she got it or who taught her how to use it. And the fact that she was hospitalised from the beatings that he gave her, she lost a baby. She was sick for weeks and the jury heard none of it.
Mrs. Ellis may have been better off with you as an advocate.
Couldn't have been worse. They were looking out for their own. They didn't want to know what decent boy Blakely was really like.
The mystery of how she obtained the freshly oiled and loaded gun was left unexplored. The prolonged physical abuse she suffered was not made clear to the jury, and there was little effort to explain her complex emotions on the night of the murder.
They'd made no effort to discredit the prosecution case and would subject the witnesses of the prosecution to a minimum of cross-examination. It's obvious that evidence about the gun was nowhere near detailed enough for any balanced jury to convict upon. And any competent lawyer would have played on the fact that the ballistics had not been carried out on the gun. Too many crucial questions were left unasked.
There's always a temptation to think, well, could her trial have been done differently? But the defence get one go at it, and they have to decide how to work their defence. But of course, that first question asked by the prosecuting counsel, why did you do it? She said, I wanted to kill him, and she did. So really, she was convicted because of what she herself had said at her trial, quite voluntarily.
After less than half an hour's deliberation, the jury found Ruth guilty. She was sentenced to death. In 1955, however, opposition to the death penalty in Britain was growing. A royal commission had already investigated the practice and concluded it offered little deterrent to crime. Prominent miscarriages of justice had shocked the nation, and even those in favour of capital punishment often hesitated at the thought of executing a woman. A campaign for clemency was launched on Ruth's behalf. Petitions urging a reprieve gained thousands of signatures around the world. But Ruth herself had no desire to escape execution. She just wanted to be with David again. The Home Secretary, too, saw no reason for the law not to take its course. There would be no reprieve.
I'm sorry.
Sign the petition.
We should be moving off very shortly, sir.
Sign it.
Is this young lady bothering you, sir?
No, not at all. Thank you.
Do you have a ticket, miss?
Yeah, it's here.
Can you step this way, please?
I have it.
You've been bothering this gentleman quite enough.
I have it.
Excuse me. It's here. It's on your clipboard.
Be more careful in future, miss. Sir?
Thank you.
Hand me the petition.
Thanks.
Ruth's death strengthened public opinion against the death penalty. Within a decade, the practice would end in Great Britain. The prejudices of sex and class that helped send Ruth to the gallows, however, would prove far more stubborn.